In 1882, the philosopher Nietzsche declared God was dead. In 2024, we're teaching machines to think like gods. The connection between these two moments is going to determine whether humanity survives the next 50 years. I'm Evan Goldstein. I'm a licensed professional engineer and a data scientist. I'm building AI Capitalist to talk to the leaders and the thinkers, like you, about navigating this new world of thinking machines. So picture this. It's 1648, and Europe is crawling out of 30 years of the most brutal religious warfare in human history. Cities have been reduced to ash, entire populations have been wiped out, Catholics and Protestants have been slaughtering each other over theological differences that, by the end, most soldiers can't even remember. The intellectuals of the day, the philosophers, the scientists, the political leaders, they're sitting in the ruins and looking around and thinking, we can never let this happen again. So they make a deal. It's not written down anywhere. Nobody signs a treaty, but it's understood by everyone who matters. Now the deal goes like this. Religion becomes private. Whatever you believe about God, or meaning, or purpose, that's between you and your conscience. Science becomes facts, data, measurable reality. That's what we'll use to run society. It seems brilliant at the time. No more wars over whose interpretation of scripture is correct. No more burning people at the stake for heresy. Just clean, objective, rational governance based on what we can prove and measure. But here's what they didn't see coming. By making meaning private and measurement public, they accidentally created a world where the things that matter to most human beings, purpose, connection, transcendence, became irrelevant to how we organize society. And that decision, made in the smoking ruins of 17th century Europe, set us on a path that led us directly to where we are today. A civilization that's so spiritually bankrupt that we're about to hand over our decision-making to artificial minds with no idea what values those minds should optimize for. You might be wondering what this has to do with artificial intelligence. Everything, because we're about to repeat the exact same mistake, but this time with machines that can think faster and more logically than we can. Now let's start with something that most people don't know. Before the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church was basically the ultimate social network. They had something like 100 feast days a year. Think about that. That's like modern tech companies with their unlimited PTO, game rooms, and constant celebrations, except the whole of society was invited. People would take time off work, they threw massive parties, and they had what were essentially community-wide festivals. The church wasn't this grim, austere, moral enforcer of an institution that we imagine today. It was just the place where life happened, where communities gathered, where meaning and celebration intersected. And here's what's crucial to understand. The ratio of different types of sins that the church cared about changed dramatically from medieval times through the early modern period. In the medieval church, sexual sins were relatively low priority. Nobility had mistresses and concubines, and the church actually sponsored certain forms of what we now call adult entertainment. And medieval people had significantly more relaxed attitudes about privacy and intimacy and even violence than we do today. The big sins were things like pride, greed, and challenging the church's spiritual authority. The focus was on maintaining social cohesion and spiritual order, not in policing people's bedrooms. But here's what gets interesting today. What killed traditional religion wasn't science exactly. It was the church's obsession with moral policing instead of meaning-making. The institution became much more an institution of social control. For the first few centuries after Christianity's founding, atheism was seen as like a masculine thing. You were facing the world alone, rationally, without supernatural help. At the same time, the medieval church was heavily misogynistic, but it was also mystical and mysterious, and it dealt with forces beyond rational comprehension. But as the church became more focused on controlling behavior rather than exploring meaning, it lost its connection to the transcendent. And this can get a little bit unsettling for those building AI systems, because we're seeing similar trends in AI development today. We're creating artificial minds that are going to inherit our current moral framework, which is to say, no coherent moral framework at all. Just like the post-Reformation church became obsessed with rules instead of purpose, we're obsessed with AI safety guidelines instead of asking what AI should actually be optimizing for. Science and its resulting materialism makes perfect sense as a methodology. For science to work properly, you have to eliminate variables that you can't observe or measure. You create controlled conditions, and then you test hypotheses, and you build predictive models. I spent my career doing exactly that, analyzing data patterns and building reliability models, optimizing systems. Science becomes an incredibly powerful predictive tool that generates so much success and so much technological advancement that you start thinking that it's all that you need. It's like data analytics filtering out noise to find patterns, but sometimes that noise contains the most important information of all. But the crucial point that everyone misses is that the purpose of eliminating the unmeasurable in the scientific context is very specific. You're trying to isolate variables to understand cause and effect. The easy answer that everyone jumps to is that science caused religion's decline, but that's not actually what happened. Charles Taylor, who wrote this massive book called A Secular Age, specifically on this topic, came up with this thesis where he wanted to study this phenomenon of the decline of religion and spirituality and meaning outside of the influence of science. Did have enormous impact, but it fits into this interlocking framework with lots of cultural assumptions that we don't even think about. The real factors Taylor identifies for what he calls the death of God are much more complex. And by the way, when I refer to the death of God, I don't mean either the Christian view of Jesus on the cross or the cultural view that spirituality isn't real. I'm just referring to the culture's change in the view of spirituality where it took a back seat to science. So the real factors that Taylor identifies for what he calls the death of God are much more complex. First, it was in the self-interest of political elites to get rid of religion because religious authority competed with the state's authority. It's a lot easier to mobilize and control populations when there's no higher authority that the government could appeal to, or that the people could appeal to over the government. Secondly, Christianity became disconnected from lived experience, and it became more and more about moral policing than spiritual transformation. Instead of helping people navigate the mystery of existence, it became a set of rules about behavior. And this is what we're going through with AI development. We're so focused on making sure that AI systems follow our behavioral guidelines that we're ignoring the deeper question. What should these systems be trying to achieve? Now, the parallels get even more disturbing when you look at how the scientific revolution actually started. Early science was actually an extension of the magical worldview, not a replacement for it. Practically every inventor of the scientific method got their ideas from or dabbled in mysticism and esoteric traditions. Galileo, who's the guy that everyone points to as the symbol of science defeating religion, got his idea that the earth revolved around the sun from the Hermetica, which is ancient mystical texts that talked about the sun as the divine center of reality. The Catholic Church actually funded and protected his research for decades until a political squabble that came up later in his life. Now, the church really fumbled it with Galileo, and it made them look like anti-science traditionalists, even though they were actually the biggest funder of scientific research in Europe at that time. But by taking a literalistic interpretation of the Bible, they were trying to say that physical space operates exactly like spiritual space. In mystical traditions, you can move up the great chain of being towards heaven, which symbolizes purifying the self spiritually, operating your mind at a healthier frequency and becoming more aligned with the transcendent reality. That's how someone like Dante perceived the world, and it's a sophisticated framework for understanding consciousness and meaning. But the Catholic Church was trying to say that's actually how the physical reality worked, that heaven was literally up there in space somewhere, when it turned out that physical reality is just matter, energy, and vast amounts of empty space. And once that was known, it became an indefensible position. So Christianity ended up looking foolish and furthering a purely materialistic worldview. It's like programmers warning about AI being dangerous, but also being completely fascinated by its capabilities. You'll see a lot of that on this channel. We know that there are risks, but we can't resist pushing the boundaries because the technology is so compelling. Now, in ancient times, this created one of Christianity's weakest intellectual positions, just when it needed to be at its strongest. And this is where the real tragedy begins, because what happened next shaped everything about how we think about it, knowledge and meaning, and now artificial intelligence. The separation of science and mysticism and religion happened in the late 17th century, right after those devastating religious wars that I mentioned earlier. The unifying thread had been the scientists themselves, who were using mystical and religious principles to develop scientific methods. But with the end of the 30 Years' War, there was no mass there was such a mass horror at what religious conflicts had produced. So Europe entered this tacit psychological deal, and I mentioned it earlier, where meaning and religion are innately subjective. So let's not fight each other over who's correct. Everyone can have their own private religion that exists in their minds, independent from physical reality. Religion isn't a map of reality, science is. This created space for society to become secularized. But that space gradually shrank until religion had no place in public life at all. Initially, you could still have Lutheran expectations in Germany or Catholic in France. But for international science, you couldn't put those understandings of reality onto your research. Science became purely material and could not study meaning. Religion became purely subjective and internal. Problem was that mysticism, which is more direct spiritual experience, exists at the crossroads between both. Mysticism is private religious experience, and it actually created both religion and science originally. Think about if someone had a nightmare of something horrible happening, if they had visited hell. Today we would say, oh, you had a bad dream. I'm sorry you had a bad dream. But in reality, we all understand that's that person's experience. But in a mystical sense, that person actually went to hell and experienced those horrors and came back. The experience was and is reality. And this is something that we have to consider in pursuing artificial general intelligence, because we can simulate a lot of the functions of the human mind, but we can't simulate or create experience. As far as we can tell, the AI isn't experiencing anything when it's chatting with you or doing the tasks you give it. It's just functioning mechanically. When we're perceiving artificial intelligence from the modern scientific materialistic sense, there's no way that we could really say that isn't an actual soul in the machine. This is where the Turing test comes in, right? Because we're saying if we can't perceive a difference, if we can't measure a difference, then it is effectively real. Whereas because these machines are, as far as we can tell, not having experiences, means they're not, according to the spiritual framework. Mysticism is private religious experience, and it had actually created both religion and science originally. Ancient mystics were the first natural philosophers, the first people to systematically study both the inner and outer reality. With the elimination of mysticism from serious intellectual conversation, religion, spirituality lost connection to genuine spiritual experience, and it became just following rules and social conformity. And this killed religion's ability to actually touch people's hearts or to provide real guidance for navigating life's challenges. For science, it became completely cut off from subjective human experience and from values. And it created this deeply schizophrenic worldview where the things that we can measure became the only things that matter. So now we're building AI systems with the same split personality framework. We're creating artificial minds that can optimize anything that we can quantify, but we have no coherent way to tell them what's actually worth optimizing for. And therefore, they do not have ethics. And if you're getting value from this video, I would appreciate it if you would press the like button. Pressing like lets me know that I'm making content that you want to see, and it helps spread that content to others. Thank you for helping us break AI capitalists out of small channel hell. Small channel hell is a real place. The first generation of scientific thinkers was done practically by Hermetic philosophers, people who saw science as part of a larger spiritual project. The Renaissance idea of improving human society came from Hermetic texts. So I should quickly describe what Hermeticism was. It was a spiritual and philosophical tradition that was based on writings that were attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, who was a mystical figure who blended some aspects of the Egyptian god Thoth and for the Greek god Hermes. And it began about the 2nd century BCE. Hermeticism emphasizes the interconnectedness of all things, and it believes that the universe and the individual reflect each other in a relationship that was summed up by the phrase, as above, so below. So they believed in a singular divine source that was called the all, or the one mind, from which all reality flows. And the tradition teaches that true wisdom, or gnosis, comes through personal spiritual insight rather than external authority, and it views the mind as the fundamental substance of the universe, which is a concept known as mentalism. So even the scientific method of testing thesis against antithesis to get synthesis, that's alchemy, which is a form of Hermeticism. So you can see Hermetic influence everywhere in early America because the founding fathers were heavily influenced by Masonic traditions, and those traditions drew on Hermetic philosophy. It sounds like conspiracy theory stuff, but if you actually study these thinkers, they were basing their ideas on sophisticated philosophical traditions. In a highly religious society, they looked to earlier religious and mystical ideas for guidance. The original philosophy of science was that scientific progress and spiritual development were part of the same process of improving consciousness. You face challenges, and then by working to overcome your limitations through that struggle, you develop higher capacities for understanding reality. But the first generation of Hermetic-based science was crushed in the early 17th century because of the wars of religion. This created a massive distrust of anything mystical or spiritual. In the 18th century, these initial religious and mystical ideas got fed into purely secular concepts, and the Enlightenment was based on pure rationality without these earlier spiritual foundations. Now, the problem with pure reason was that it became unmoored from an understanding of human nature or context. In trying not to contradict religious beliefs, we created science independent from meaning, but in doing so, it became completely disconnected from the actual internal reality of the human experience. It's like AI systems optimizing for measurable metrics while ignoring unmeasurable human values. We can make our systems incredibly efficient at achieving specific goals, but if we can't define what goals are actually worth achieving, efficiency becomes meaningless or even destructive. And here's where things get really concerning for anyone building AI systems today. Because as science gained more predictive power, so did atheism and the rejection of traditional meaning-making or ethical frameworks. People just consistently saw that science worked. Science has radically improved almost every aspect of life in modern society, and the technological transformation has been incredible. But people started to associate scientific methodology with nihilism, the belief that nothing has ultimate meaning or purpose. And this happened because we lost the distinction between science as a method and scientism as worldview. Science has power because of what the philosopher Michael Strevens calls the iron law of science. You take a single principle, test it rigorously, and through systematic testing, you can isolate what's happening based on which hypothesis the evidence supports. But science, precisely because of its power, is limited in its scope. It's a testing system for specific types of questions, but you can't use a testing system for your entire worldview because your worldview stems from your values, what you care about, your understanding of purpose and meaning. What happened instead was that different groups started using scientific language to rationalize their own interests very effectively. They would fund studies that supported their preferred conclusions. And we're now living in a worldview based on scientism, not on science. People make stuff up and call it scientific. That's how we ended up with ideological concepts being presented as objective facts. None of these ideological principles are actually scientific, but every part of the political spectrum has gone through phases where they claim that scientific authority supported their preferred beliefs. What people did was take a testing method for assessing specific claims about physical reality, and then they used it to argue that things that they subjectively believed were objectively true. And this is what's happening with AI development. We're building systems that can process information and optimize outcomes, but we're treating them as if they can determine what outcomes are worth optimizing for. It's not a technical problem, it's a philosophical problem, and requires wisdom, traditions that science alone can't provide. And this brings us to the most dangerous parallel of all, because businesses that are adopting AI need to work with advisors who understand both technical capabilities and the philosophical implications of these systems. AI models you choose and how you implement them are going to reflect your values, whether you realize it or not. You can learn more about navigating these challenges at the website aicapitalist.biz. Right now, we're training AI systems on the accumulated knowledge of a civilization has spent 3 centuries systematically eliminating meaning from its understanding of reality. These systems are learning from our books, our conversations, our debates, all of which reflect this spiritual bankruptcy that I've been describing. Now think about what that means. We're creating artificial minds that can process information faster than any human, that can identify patterns that we'd never notice, that can optimize complex systems in ways we never imagined. But these minds are inheriting a worldview where the question, what should we optimize for, has no coherent answer. When I'm building a reliability model for a facility, I can optimize for cost reduction, for energy efficiency, safety compliance, or equipment longevity. But the deeper question, what makes a university worth maintaining? What kind of learning environments serves human flourishing? What's the actual purpose of education? Those questions require wisdom traditions that pure data analysis can't provide. We're building AI systems within the same fractured framework that separated facts from values and measurement from meaning. And just like the post-Reformation separation of science and religion, it's going to have consequences that we haven't really thought through. Because what no one's talking about is that artificial intelligence isn't just going to automate existing processes. It's going to force us to be explicit about our values in ways that we've been avoiding for centuries. When you hand decision-making over to systems that optimize for specific goals, you can't avoid the question of what those goals are and what goals are worth pursuing. And this is where the story comes full circle in the most unexpected way. We're approaching what might be the most important inflection point in human history. For the first time since the 17th century, we're going to be forced to have serious conversations about ultimate questions. Not because we want to, but because we're building minds that are going to need answers to those questions in order to function. What does it mean to live a good life? How do we balance individual autonomy with collective well-being? What are our obligations to future generations? These aren't abstract philosophical puzzles anymore. They're engineering requirements for AI systems that are going to shape every aspect of our lives. The materialist framework that dominated the last 3 centuries doesn't provide the tools for answering these questions. Materialism can tell you how things work, but it can't tell you what's worth working toward. It can optimize systems, but it can't determine what outcomes those systems should be optimized for. This is why I believe that we're not actually living through the death of God. We're living through the resurrection of ultimate concerns and the rebirth of spirituality. The questions that the Enlightenment tried to eliminate as unscientific are coming back to haunt us as technological necessities. We can try to avoid these questions, and we can hand them over to systems that will make value judgments by default based on whatever implicit biases exist in their training data. Or we can reclaim the wisdom traditions that previous generations spent centuries developing to address exactly these challenges. The AI systems that we're building aren't just tools, they're mirrors that reflect our spiritual and philosophical development. If we're spiritually bankrupt, they'll amplify the bankruptcy. But if we can reconnect with our traditions of wisdom that integrate rational analysis with meaning-making, we might build systems that actually serve human flourishing.